So I don't know how many times I used the word unpack in this speech. Why don't you count them? Thank you so much for that, Alexis. So I'm so humbled and delighted to be here today and to celebrate this moment with you all. And I'd also like to take a moment to recognize all those that supported your path here, those who provided the sustenance, enabling you to take the steps that will allow you to thrive. So that sustenance, of course, isn't just those essential goods like food or safety or enough money to pay the rent, although those are very important. It's that invisible care work and that everyday support that's provided by staff members, family, and friends who helped you work out so many complicated choices. That sustenance is your peers and professors who continue to push you to question your assumptions or to master the details of an argument. And though it doesn't always feel like it, sustenance is those people, sometimes our kin, sometimes near strangers, who start the difficult conversations asking why you're making certain choices, who disagree with you, who press you to substantiate your points, sometimes changing them. That intellectual dexterity and flexibility is sustenance as well. So I'm blessed and I'm very proud to have my BA, MA, and PhD in Women and Gender Sexuality Studies. So that's 16 years of training, including my time as a high school literature professor. And I'm now hitting the mark where I'm closer to 40 than to 30. And so when I chose to major in women's studies in the late 1990s, it was still fairly new to have a devoted course of training in the field. So my alma mater also developed its major in the late 90s. I think I was one of 2 graduating seniors. And today I look around and I see 28 majors, minors, and certificates, plus countless others who take our electives. So amidst all the news reports on women in politics or whether affirmative action is still relevant, you all are testimony to the rapidly expanding vitality of this mode of inquiry. And I'm excited to see the directions that you'll take it. So when acquaintances or strangers ask what I do, learn I'm a gender studies professor, pause, and then far too rarely for my taste, ask what exactly gender studies is. More and more, I'm starting to say that this is a field that is devoted to examining how communities and individuals get the sustenance they need to thrive in the many diverse ways that we should be able to live our lives. What sustains us, of course, is highly individualized and context-specific, but there are common structures that help channel sustenance to us all. It's a kind of shared root system. And part of feminism is to examine how resources like education, like career opportunities, like safety, like mentoring, like social recognition are channeled to some groups so much more often than others. It looks at how institutional forces like our immigration system or family leave programs or cultural definitions of racial equality help ensure that some have more access to opportunities and decision-making than others. Thus, part of feminist social justice projects start from the proudly radical principle that access to those resources must be channeled in a more equitable way so that more of us are not only resilient to life's uncertainties, but can thrive. And then we have a lot of debates and arguments about what exactly that equitability looks like. So, I said the F word, feminism. And from its earliest roots, feminism has been maligned for being too radical, for being too demanding, departing too far from tradition, and unrealistically upending the basic structures of society. Alternatively, feminism has been dismissed for being just over. Women are the CEOs of GM and Yahoo. The Affordable Care Act covers birth control. Abortion is still legal. The White House just issued a report on sexual assault on campuses, and women are graduating at higher rates from college than men. But that gesture of both dismissing feminism as too radical and too overlooks the immense amount of work that was never in the least finished, such as racial and gender equality. And it conceals how so much work has really just begun. We're just starting to see glimmers of a new national discussion around trans identity and socioeconomic justice. And by the way, that fight for same-sex marriage is not nearly over. And that gesture of dismissing feminism as too radical or too over also obscures projects that we cannot possibly conceive of. And you all get to determine what those projects are. So the word radical means of or having roots. That is that which is fundamental to life and vitality. And I want to linger on that. So a chore for my mom and her siblings was to pull the weeds out of the grass and display their roots to my grandmother. And I like to imagine those roots were presented as a bouquet, root up. Last night my mom told me I made that up, though. And now we'll come back into this. So what I like about that anecdote is that pulling something out by the roots is an ambivalent process when it comes to social justice politics. Roots are both a necessary life spring as well as something that can bind us. Marcus Garvey wrote that a people without the knowledge of their past is like a tree without roots. And for that reason, gender, ethnic, and LGBT studies have devoted significant time to developing a sense of history, to writing down the root. But roots can become restrictive if that history is defined too rigidly or singularly. They can make us immobile. So Isabel Allende wrote that being a writer comes from the experience of being cut away from her roots and being unable to find herself for years and years. Feminisms then points to how rooting ourselves has both possibilities and constraints. And similarly, the examination and the exposure of roots, it's not just a death, as it was for my grandmother, it's a useful possibility. Whether or not you self-identify with feminist, queer, or racial justice politics, the radical usefulness of your education is that it's about getting to the roots of both systemic inequality and the sources of sustenance that create diverse kinds of vitality. So memory is highly suggestible, and we have this tendency to reinvent the past to suit our present needs. But when I reach into my memory and root around for why I chose this particular past, I come up less with specific events and more with memories of what I would now call social contradictions. One of the reasons I made a life commitment to this field is that it helped me understand and name those larger scale processes that I more sensed than understood. Whether it was the impossibility of fulfilling bodily norms that consumed so much of my creativity as a teenager, the heterosexual expectations that just pinched what I learned to call my queer desires, and the way that bald prejudice didn't seem to adequately describe what felt like much deeper processes of racism and homophobia, or the sense that educational achievements just couldn't be as simple as intellectual ability and work ethic. Those accounts felt partial, and there had to be other forces at play. So my mom had 4 kids, but she took the time to expose me as a preteen to books by Toni Morrison and Dorothy Allison and Mary Crodog, books that were about the everyday way individuals navigate sexually violent and racist cultures that denied them sustenance. So I didn't still have quite that particular language. That was Audre Lorde and Ani DeFranco and my professors, and my parents in their own way. But these texts pointed to the systemic forces shaping what at that point I just understood as a deep unfairness perpetuated by one individual upon another. The people and characters in those books also embodied a kind of resilience as they struggled in everyday ways to create a world that was otherwise. So, like you, I suspect, my gender studies classes helped provide me with a vocabulary and a mode of analysis to understand those processes better. Thus, while this field is intellectually rigorous and exacting, and you all know that from the classes you've taken with your professors here, this field is also challenging because it can be tremendously personal. As a college education should be, in that it's preparing you for both a career, but also an engaged life. It helps you develop the intellectual curiosity, inquiry, and problem-solving skills that sustain us as the lifelong learners we have to be. Part of those inquiry skills have to do with thinking more complexly about how our life experiences are shaped by the cultural and political institutions surrounding us. And that's not a self-indulgent process, but that is one that's essential to understanding our role in this very politically messy and uneven world. Therefore, if this field has enabled someone you know to heal and regain dignity from violence, if it's helped you identify the sometimes cunning ways homophobia and racism close doors for you or your allies, if it is named how so many kinds of unmarked privilege shape opportunities and disadvantages, then those are deeply personal insights. They get to the root of systemic power inequalities and how they shape individual experiences, what Gloria Anzaldúa and Sherry Moraga dubbed theory in the flesh, as my students better know. So you don't need to have been the recipient of those experiences to feel them as personal. We're all unwitting beneficiaries of social injustice, just some more than others. So rather than guilt, this can be a powerful motivation for compassion and activism. So when I was in college, that kind of analysis helped me decide that I wanted to shift from preparing for a career in medicine to one in college-level research and teaching, and I'm happy to talk about how my parents responded to that. But I wanted a hand in helping my students and readers explore those deep roots. So you're probably annoyed at this point by that question of what are you going to do with your gender studies degree, right? But I'd like you to remind those people that doing is not just a hard skill, like writing code or performing a medical procedure. It's also a kind of intellectual reflex, a way of asking good questions, analyzing presumptions, and adapting to unforeseen situations. And for this, gender studies prepares you exceptionally well. The roots of one plant are often entangled with another, and sometimes they fuse. So you know how to look at the ways that multiple institutional forces work in tandem with each other, to assess, for example, how glass ceilings and gendered barriers to achievement have perhaps a little less to do with a failure to lean in, and more to do with the way that the workplace is set up for employees who must shift their schedule at a moment's notice or work 50 to 80 hours a week uninterrupted by the needs of an ill child or a parent. In an economically precarious environment, we all lean in. There's been a lot of leaning in over a lot of time. So you know to ask the questions of who performs that care labor and how it impacts their ability to take that extra shift or work all evening. You know to look at how gendered, racial, and class dynamics work in tandem with each other, so that when that labor is outsourced to daycare, to schools, it's often poorly paid migrants and women of color who do it. In a career setting, this reflex of examining the entangled roots of social dilemmas has given you the training to look at multiple facets of a problem. Whether that's examining how a student's challenges learning how to read might be the combined effect of a different learning style in an overcrowded classroom, or to develop an alternative marketing platform or product as business climates change. This training has taught you to examine the often contradictory structures that channel resources and opportunities unevenly, like a culture that claims to promote the well-being of all kids, but still sanctions low minimum wages, overcrowded classrooms, and unpaid family leave, making it very hard for those kids and their families to thrive. You are equipped to examine how taken for granted processes can limit opportunities, how the way we organize our world into those narrow categories of masculine and feminine, white and black, straight and gay, don't reflect the way we live and need to live to thrive. You also use those contradictions to make pragmatic compromises. For instance, you know the benefits of expanding legal recognitions of marriage and anti-discrimination protections to same-sex couples or trans folks. And I'm continually inspired by the way you balance the hard work to create those reforms, like gender-inclusive bathrooms in some CU buildings, with a pragmatic understanding of their limits. For you are also cognizant of the fact that changing those modes of recognition, changing the law, and punishing a few high-profile people is just not enough. Certainly, outrage is warranted when the owner of the LA Clippers basketball team spouts his racist beliefs. But you can also discuss how loud outrage and the sanctioning of those so-called bad apples obscures the much more everyday and systematic ways that discrimination still operates to disparage communities of color, and black men in particular. You are able to identify when our policy remedies around something like sexual harassment on college campuses are merely ripping the tops off the most visible social problems, the stubborn roots remaining deeply embedded. And my grandmother would make my mother go dig those weeds back up. So, if this field is about pulling up social problems by their entangled roots, then we also need to remember that we can't get to all the roots, nor do we want to. we need to ask exactly who decides what a weed is. And we need to remember that what is often designated as a weed is often a very different and valuable way of knowing. This field teaches us that the denigration of our desires, politics, and gender identities can be used to create different kinds of communities, to take care of each other when your leaders will not. It's this deep-rootedness that is valuable because it strives to generate a world that embraces, rather than eliminates, a variety of different ways to live, providing many kinds of sustenance. And it teaches resilience, a tool that I've seen you exercise so often when your project doesn't come together and you evaluate why and you take a new tact, when your thesis didn't go as planned and you use that opportunity to write an article or to pursue an internship. And the work you put into your communities is also an essential part of that resilience. Whether it's keeping someone company through a hard night, helping them revise a paper, or having a very difficult conversation, the caring I see you give to each other is an inspiration. You've taught me in new ways about how essential that care work is to politics and academic work. And you've shown me so many creative but incisive ways that care work manifests itself, whether it's the panels you've developed, the conversations you started, the op-eds you've all written. So thank you for reminding me of how much a life spring those acts of caring and creativity are. It's one of the many reasons I'm grateful to have had the privilege to work here with you and at CU. As a final note, that care work also creates an adaptiveness. So remember that you have the skills to bounce back from what are the inevitable deviations and mistakes you'll encounter in your next steps. And some of those deviations are really good because they help you hone in on just what it is you need to thrive and what environments can better provide that. You may be bound for finance or for education, law, nonprofits, or marketing. And some of your plans, I do think, will go as hoped. But it's inevitable that many will not. So I found, for myself at least, that it's best to try to embrace that unknowingness. That's not to dismiss the deep and often material anxieties that uncertainty can bring. And it's not to ignore the need to try to make the best decisions by weighing the information you have at the moment with your goals and your desires. But embracing uncertainty accounts for the fact that we never have all the needed information. Some we're not privy to, but more importantly, some has not unfolded yet. And when we study activist movements, whether the repeal of the Defense of Marriage Act, the Occupy movement, or the right to retain the most basic access to birth control and abortion, both of which are under assault, those activists are committed to a certain openness in the future, where the world can be otherwise than it is. So I invite us to embrace that openness, to dwell in possibility, as Emily Dickinson put it, with all the unknowingness that accompanies it. Make a bouquet out of those unknown roots you will encounter and plant them everywhere. Grazie mille, 1,000 thank yous for allowing me to share and to celebrate the past 2 years with you.